Rarely has a special election gotten as much national attention as the one taking place today in Virginia. So let's explore a little bit more. Joining us now, Karen Holt, political science professor at Virginia Tech University, someone we often turn to for political expertise in the Commonwealth. Karen, thanks for being here. Look, early voter turnout was very high, almost as much as last year when Virginia was electing a governor. So what do you believe is driving voters on both sides of this?
Well, I think the people with whom you talk picked up quite a bit of it. On the one hand, this has moved to be changed into a national issue that is not about representation in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but rather a way to frame what's going on in Virginia as a response to President Trump's urging Republican states to redistrict their states so that there could be more U.S. House members on the Republican side in order to support President Trump while he was in office. So to that extent, then, people in Virginia are basically being asked to say, I'm not going to vote so much for who I want to represent me in Virginia, but rather I'm thinking about focusing on the national level. At the same time, people like the folks in Spotsylvania are thinking, we just voted for pretty massively across the state for changing how we do redistricting in Virginia, and that is take it out of the hands of the state legislators and instead give it to a bipartisan commission. So there's some sense in which that's why the man said, we feel fooled once and now we're getting fooled again. Others would say that's only half the story. The other half of the story is that what the Virginia legislature decided it had to do to respond to what Republicans in other states were doing was basically to say, you know what, two can play this game, and if we're going to argue over the House of Representatives redistricting, then it may be that some Democratic states need to be involved as well. So that's the other side of the story.
Yeah, Karen, that tit for tat for sure. Now, Karen, one thing we have heard is, though, that many people who are voting from them, some people said they were confused about what exactly they're voting for. As you said, they feel misled. Do you believe this is because of the complexity of this issue?
I think a couple of things. One is it's surprise. No one expected another election on redistricting after the state just passed that redistricting initiative that gave the power of redistricting to the bipartisan commission and took it away from the state legislators. So I think the soonness of this change came as some surprise. The other part that was a surprise to people is the timing of it and the way it was framed. It happened very fast. It's been held up in court now and then, and some of the information that came out about it came out quite late. And so people weren't quite sure what they were voting for. And then add to that some of the different kinds of information that was presented about what the initiative actually, what the referendum actually does. Arguably, in this case before the Virginia State Supreme Court as we speak, but there's some who argue that what the legislature did in writing the legislative language does not fully reflect what the amendment does. It is a temporary change in how redistricting is done. It goes back to what's in the Constitution now as of 2030. In fact, October 2030, we go back to the way we've been doing it. So that hasn't been fully left in place. Moreover, other people didn't quite understand what was driving this to begin with, that it wasn't really focused on giving power back to Virginia legislators. Rather, it was saying we're involved in a set of arguments about what ought to be done at the national level. So people in Virginia are not surprisingly focusing on the Commonwealth. People that put together the redistricting initiative or referendum are saying we need to focus first on what's happening in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and Karen, if voters do approve of this, we want to remind you folks at home, Democrats could flip as many as 4 U.S. House seats from red to blue, likely regain control of the House. I want to know if you recall a special state election that's had such high stakes on the national stage.
To the extent that states are pretty evenly divided and we can't predict what's going to happen in some of these U.S. House elections, it can well be that small changes can lead to larger reverberating changes. Having said that, though, I think it's important to remember that even if this referendum passes, that still does not mean either that it will get approval by the Virginia State Supreme Court or, by the way, that in fact that when voters vote in November, they in fact will be voting the way all the predictions are going. The way we find out what happens in midterm elections is not that we draw district lines, we go out and have people cast ballots. So we don't know what's going to happen in November.
And Republicans say this is a blatant power grab. Democrats argue
Yes.
It's just the counter move, as you talked about, the redistricting that Republicans made in other states. Do you think this is just going to be the new norm where each party is just making moves in reaction to the other one?
In the short run, yes. In the longer run, I don't think so. I think, in
done.
fact, as the Spotsylvania voters said, one of the difficulties this particular election has is it's put Governor Spanberger in a very difficult place. She did not want this to happen. However, she is the newly elected Democratic governor of Virginia. She has to deal with the Democratic legislature, and she has to act as governor of the entire state and work with the other parts of government. She did not expect or want this particular issue to be among the first things on her plate, but there it is. So there's some concern that if in fact it passes, that ends up hurting Governor Spanberger and the Democrats in Virginia as much as it does maybe help Republicans at the national level.
All right, Karen Holt, a professor in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech University. Thank you so much for joining us, for your time and your expertise. We appreciate it.
Good to talk with you.
Okay.